Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome, everybody here in the room, and welcome to everybody that's joining us online to the third installment of our program, Sing Every Day, Jewish Music and Spirituality. Today is the third lecture of this three-parter, and so it's the third and final lecture, but I know we'll all be very sad when this is over. Um, I also, so let me uh, also give you a sense of what's coming up for ASU Jewish Studies. The next public offering that we have is going to be in January, and on January 25th, we'll be hosting. And I think it's here in the library. Is that correct, Lisa? The Jews and Sports program that's here in this room, probably. Okay, but here at the Valley of the Sun, there'll be a program on Jews and sports with my colleague Sean Klein, who is a professor of philosophy in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies. So I hope that you all join us for that program as well, and that's a two-parter as well. So it's my great honor to introduce Professor Cherlin. Michael Cherlin was born into a Yiddish milieu in the Bronx in September of 1946. Michael's mother was the only sibling of three born in America, her parents and her brothers and sisters having immigrated from Galicia. Michael's father was the sole surviving child of Lithuanian Jews. He immigrated from Vilna to the US as a teenager in the 1920s. Early in his career, Michael was a performing musician. And as he approached the age of 30, Michael began pursuing a scholarly career, eventually earning a PhD in music theory from Yale University. Michael retired from the University of Minnesota in 2016. He currently lives in Chandler, Arizona. And in addition to numerous articles in scholarly journals, Michael has published three books: Schoenberg's Musical Imagination. I think I finally pronounced that correctly, but third time's a charm. Varieties of Musical Irony, and Music's Making, The Poetry of Music and Music of Poetry. Time and health permitting, a fourth book is in the works. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Cherlin.
Thank you all for coming. Happy Hanukkah. Emmanuel Levinas and responsibility to the other human being, Hineni. The Hebrew word Hineni is a commonplace in Torah. When used in response to a call, it indicates the readiness of the person addressed to listen or obey. Its first occurrence in Torah is in Genesis 22, verse 1, when God calls Abraham by name and Abraham responds, Hineni, translated as, here I am. Sepharia tells me that a literal translation would be, behold me. No matter how it is translated, Hineni is an attention getter of a double sort. The one who responds is intensely focused on the speaker, as the one who speaks is intensely focused on the one who is responding. And so this intensity of response further translates into a mutual responsibility. For Levinas, responsibility to the other is always understood as responsibility to another human being. And this is paramount and foundational in Levinas's thought. In opening Levinas's thought to the makings of music, I expand his notion of engagement with the other to include ways of saying that are nonverbal, music and the visual arts included. Another natural step, more inclusive than interhuman responsibilities to one another, is our responsibility to our environment and to all things and beings in nature. There is evidently some ambiguity as to which calendar recorded Levinas's birth date, either late 1905 or early 1906. He passed away in December of 1995 at the age of 89. He lived all his later years in France. Levinas's early life is nicely chronicled in Ethan Kleinberg's book, Emmanuel Levinas's Talmudic Turn. Kleinberg understands Levinas's thought as comprising a three-strand braid: Western philosophy, French Enlightenment, universalism, and Lithuanian Talmudic tradition. To these three braids, we might add one more: Levinas's early immersion in creative literature, where he develops a sensitivity to language that echoes throughout his lifetime. Levinas's parents had intended a secular education for their son, principally based on the Russian language. As a youngster, Levinas read widely in Russian literature, including Gogol, Pushkin, Dostoevsky, and Tolstoy. Events in Europe, World War I and the Russian Revolution forced a change of plans, and in 1920 Levinas began studies in German literature, Goethe in particular, opening for him yet another world of European culture. At the age of 18, Levinas moved to Strasbourg, France to attend classes at the University of Strasbourg. It was here that he began his dedicated lifelong study of philosophy. It was also during this time in Strasbourg that Levinas was influenced by the universalism of French Enlightenment thought, the second of Kleinberg's three braids. The idea that reason reveals universal truths and human rights applicable to all human beings, such as liberty and equality. These are the same ideas that resonate in our own Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I don't think I ever ran across Levinas mentioning Tom Jefferson, but he might have. It was during this time as well that Levinas first read Edmund Husserl, beginning his studies in phenomenology, that branch of philosophy that deals with human consciousness, our lived experiences of the world. Husserl was a German Jewish philosopher whose work was banned during the Third Reich. Among his central concerns were the roles of pre-linguistic or non-linguistic thought, so that knowing could not simply be reduced to language, and intersubjectivity based on, intersubjectivity bearing false Descartes' cogito, I know, therefore I am, where knowing is seemingly based on a single, isolated individual's perception rather than through shared experience. I quote from Kleinberg's book, "For Levinas, phenomenology was the possibility of moving beyond the systematic organization of knowledge under the rubric of reason to the interrogation of the dynamic act of knowing and the mechanism of its origin. In this way, it moved past the subject-object split by emphasizing consciousness at the locus of the relationship between subject and object." As an aside, I should add that in my recent writings on music and human relationships more generally, I've explored what in grammar is called middle voice. Middle-voiced verbs exist in some languages, including ancient Sanskrit and Hebrew. The closest we come in English is reflexive verbs, where the one doing the action is also receiving the action, as in, I washed myself. Stated in somewhat technical language, I become both agent and patient, the one doing the act, the one receiving the act. In a similar way, middle voice verbs avoid or dissolve the opposition of subject and object. I imagine making music or hearing music as middle voice where ego boundary is dissolved and subject, composer, or performer, or listener and object, the music itself, merge. So far as I understand, this is not quite Levinas's position, but it seems to me that his concept of proximity, something we will explore shortly, comes very close. Levinas served in the French army during World War II. He was captured by the Germans in 1940 and spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner of war in a segregated Jewish barracks. As a soldier, he was spared the worst, but he did suffer hard labor. There is no doubt that his wartime experience had a profound influence on his mature philosophical ethics. Levinas's Talmudic turn, the third of Kleinberg's braids, came after World War II, when Levinas had settled in Paris. During this time, Levinas met and subsequently studied with an elusive, enigmatic person who went by the name of Shoshani, a mysterious figure of whom little is known, but who was revered as a master of Talmudic thought by those who knew him. Evidently, Shoshani was one of these persons with a photographic memory, and he knew Torah and Talmud, just could recall any part of it any time. I think I read that he later settled in somewhere in South America and died in obscurity. Very enigmatic person. Lithuanian Talmudic Judaism, the Mitnagedic tradition, was opposed to both the more westernized, liberalized form centered in Germany, known as Haskalah, as well as to the mystical, ecstatic Hasidic movement prevalent in Poland in the East. In reading Levinas, whether his more philosophical writings, his Talmudic commentaries, or his ideas about education in general, I find it helpful to keep in mind Kleinberg's threefold braid: Western philosophy, Enlightenment universalism, and Lithuanian Talmudic Judaism. And yet I think it's safe to say that the first two braids become infused by the ideas generated out of the third. As I've mentioned, the central core of ethics for Levinas is responsibility to the other. Against the grain of Western metaphysics, Levinas places this responsibility as existentially prior to being. I'm putting being with a capital B, more fundamental than ontology, that branch of philosophy that deals with being per se. This is an extraordinary move. I'm reminded of Jewish stories that imagine God creating a proto-Torah before creation, creation's blueprint, as it were, from which the given Torah and all the universe emerges. Just so, for Levinas, our responsibility toward others is antecedent to being itself. In Levinas's imagination, our mutual responsibility toward each other is not conditioned by our being, but rather conditions our being. A second fundamental aspect of Levinas's ethics is the essential mystery of the other. Any deep, sustained human relationship reveals aspects of the other as they augment our own sense of self. But in a profound sense, we cannot get to the bottom of things. This aspect of interhuman relationships is analogous to our relation to God. Summoning up images from the Shema, we can love God with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our might, but God's infinite self remains unknowable. Fairly or not, Levinas contrasts this aspect of human and non-human relationships and responsibility to the implied intimacy of Martin Buber's I and thou relationship. Martin Buber, for those unfamiliar with this thought, was a Viennese Jew brought up in an observant family who fused Jewish thought with secular philosophy. His most famous work, I and Thou, is titled Ich und Du in German, du being a term of intimacy or familiarity in the German language. Buber distinguishes this relationship, both interpersonal and between humans and God, from an I-it relationship. Hilary Putnam, another esteemed Jewish philosopher, in his essay Levinas and Judaism, provides an insightful critique of Levinas's assessment of Buber, along with another aspect of Levinas's thought, his tendency towards self-mortification. In many passages, Levinas's formulations of responsibility to the other, such as tearing the bread out of one's own mouth, read as self-mortification. And if you read Levinas's own words, you'll come across this again and again. Putnam is critical of the asymmetrical extreme to which Levinas describes one obligation to the other, saying that the asymmetry of the ethical relationship need not be carried as far as Levinas carries it. In commenting on Levinas's critique of Martin Buber, Putnam notes that Buber's I-thou relationship, the center of his ethics, is based on a prototype of each person's relationship to God. Thou is a term of intimacy at odds with Levinas's radical otherness of the other. Putnam argues that Levinas's ethics is one-sided, restrictive in what might comprise a relationship, and not open to alternatives. And I'll quote Putnam in this regard. It is Aristotle who taught us that to love others, one must be able to love oneself. The thought seems utterly alien to Levinas. I also describe Levinas's ethics as one-sided. It is because it is one-sided that I think Levinas's relation to Buber is fundamentally a competitive one. Rather than seeing Buber as someone who identified a different I-thou relation from Levinas's, someone who identified a different sine qua non, the essential condition of the true life, Levinas must see Buber as someone who had insights to be sure, but got it wrong. But the ethical life has more than one sine qua non, more than one essential condition. That's the end of my quote from Hilary Putnam. To amplify Putnam's important point, we can say that not all relationships are the same. I will return to this idea later in thinking about what a musical canon might entail. While I find Putnam's critique is valid and important to keep in mind, for me this doesn't diminish the validity of Levinas's central points, responsibility toward the other and the inherent mystery of the other. I should add that for me, what works best is a creative tension between the intimacy of Buber's I-thou relationship and the unfolding mystery of Levinas's responsibility to the other. The two cannot be merged together, for that would dissolve what is best in each, and yet each needs the other for a more complete sense of interpersonal ethics. We can also add that I and thou in Buber and responsibility to the other in Levinas are both first-person singular in their orientations. A full appreciation of this aspect of Levinas's ethics diffuses, or at least to a degree, Putnam's critique. The first-person singular, I, who is responsible to the other, is mirrored by the other's status as a first-person singular. The apparent asymmetry is corrected by the mutuality and reciprocity of personal responsibility to the other. To this, we should add that there are other orientations that are first-person plural. Hero Israel, Shema Yisrael, or any communal singing or praying. Clearly, being part of a family that is part of a community is as important as being an individual. The second sentence of Rabbi Hillel's famous adage, "But if I am only for myself, what am I?" can be read either as indicating our responsibility toward each other as individuals, or our responsibility as part of or to a larger community. Just as there is a productive tension between intimacy and mystery in our relationships, there is a productive tension between being a unique individual and part of a larger community or tradition. In making art, including music to be sure, this productive tension is paramount. Whether in terms of a larger community or in terms of a one-to-one relationship, it is the open-endedness that remains central to the ethics of Levinas. Levinas abhorred all totalizing thought. I'll say that again. Levinas abhorred all totalizing thought. He emphasized the open-ended relationship of each unique human to each unique other. For Levinas, it is just this ability to respond to another that allows each of us as individuals to avoid a deadening self-totalization. Can you imagine surviving the Holocaust? Totalitarianism would have been high on his list of evils in the world. At other times, Levinas uses the opposing terms synchrony and diachrony, praising the ongoing quality of diachrony and disparaging the totalizing quality of synchrony. Diachronic approaches to personal relationships or to language or art emphasize change over time. Synchronic approaches describe stable attributes or structures, whereas diachronic approaches emphasize evolving processes of knowing or relating or perceiving. Applied to art, Levinas writes insightfully that the search for new forms from which all art lives keeps awake everywhere the verbs that are on the verge of lapsing into substantives. In Levinas's theory of language, the verb is capable of saying, while the noun hardens reality into the said. From this perspective, one I share, art is precious indeed. Art vacates the vacuity of forms. A lovely thought, not filling the form, but emptying out its emptiness. I find a parallel to this concept of art in Wallace Stevens' magnificent poem, Auroras of Autumn. There Stevens writes of form gulping after formlessness. Form gulping after formlessness, where the creative process creates malleable structures, forms which remain ductile, subject to shapings and reshapings, mobile structures that become vacuous and self-destructive if they harden. Why can't you be the way you always were? In a similar way, Levinas's understanding of our responsibility to the other is mobile and malleable. As I know another human being more and more deeply over time, the only aspect that remains hard fast is my continuing responsibility to be open to that process of deepening knowledge, empathy, and the like. By my understanding, the same applies toward my relationship with a work of art, not as a thing, not as an object, but rather as a human making, a human utterance, so that as I come to know the work of art, I come to know an aspect of the person through their art. I've come to understand aspects of Levinas's ethics as instantiating augmented liminal experiences. Our word liminal is derived from the Latin limen with its cluster of meanings, including threshold, doorway, entrance, as well as beginning or commencement. We use the word subliminal to denote a stimulus below the threshold of conscious perception. A subliminal message influences us without our being aware of such influence. If we think of liminal experience in terms of threshold, a transit way, a place of transition through which we move from one place to another, or from one state of mind into another, or from one state of relationship into another, then an expanded or dilated liminal experience would entail an expanded and ongoing transitive state. We have noted that for Levinas, the verb is capable of saying, while the noun hardens reality into the said. Transformed into the metaphor of dilated liminal space, verbal transitivity is augmented, while the subtle quality of nouns is diminished. Levinas's idiosyncratic idea of proximity is a remarkable case in point, where proximity, fundamental to any ongoing human relationship, quote, is not a state, a repose, but a restlessness outside of the place of rest. Proximity does not congeal into a structure. This is Levinas. Should I read that again? That's a really important concept. It's not a state, a repose, but a restlessness outside of the place of rest. Proximity does not congeal into a structure. If we imagine ego boundaries as closed doors that seal us off one from another, then sustained proximity, in Levinas's sense, keeps the doors open, allowing us to stand at the threshold, gazing into the space that otherwise would have been sealed off. Gerald L. Bruns, in his essay, The Concept of Art and Poetry in Emmanuel Levinas's Writings, discusses art as a modality of transcendence, where art is no longer an object for us, but a thing in itself, a pure exteriority. He goes on to say that basically art is ecstasy or exteriority, temporally, as an interruption of being the entretemps. The idea that art takes us out of normal experiential time rings true for me. This is especially vivid in the temporal arts of theater, film, and music. And yet it is also apposite, for instance, in viewing a painting or sculpture. If we are attentive, responsible in Levinas's sense, we take in the art and so augment our sense of self. As the quote from Bloom's essays makes clear, pure exteriority is not equivalent to objectivity. Rather, this exteriority is the sense of being taken out of oneself, intimate contact with another. This entretemps is a French term that can be translated variously, but in Brun's context, it might be best described as a dilated liminal space. I've recently been musing over the significance of the mezuzah, the casing for a prayer, the Shema, placed at every threshold in an observant Jewish home. Levinas mentions the mezuzah in a few places, so far as I know, not emphasizing its symbolism particularly. And yet, because the importance of crossing thresholds and threshold experiences are so important in Levinas's ethic, an excursus on the mezuzah doesn't seem misplaced in our context. As we pass through the threshold, we touch the mezuzah with its implorations of divine unity and its mitzvahs of love and intergenerational teaching. We might think of the mezuzah, guardian of thresholds, as invoking the ultimate connectedness of all being. God is one, and as a symbol of our mutual responsibility to one another. Despair or disillusion can be understood as a breakdown of the connectedness of being, either without meaning or so conflict-ridden that meaning is only discovered through an ever-deepening cycle of despair. One example of such despair is found in Chaim Nachman Bialik's short poem in Peter Cole's translation entitled Over Your Heart. The opening line of the Hebrew poem might be translated literally as, "Destroyed are the heart's invalid mezuzah." Cole's lovely poetic paraphrase captures something of the essence of what a mezuzah contains or implies. Quote, "The threshold edicts of your heart are broken and sullied." The threshold edicts of your hearts are broken and sullied. A double meaning of mezuzah emerges as containing or embodying edicts placed at the threshold, as well as edicts that carry us through each threshold, each transition bodily and spiritually. The openings of musical compositions are the thresholds that bring us into the space of the piece, just as the coda space of compositions comprises retrospective glances, recollections of the musical journey that we've just completed. The opening passages of a large-scale musical composition are the mezuzah that we touch as we move into the time-space of the piece. The coda space is the second touching of the mezuzah as we exit, leaving the time-space of our musical experience to linger in our memory. If the music is joyful, it is as if we've moved into a blessed time-space. Experienced most profoundly, we remove the conditional as if, for we have indeed moved into a blessed time-space. If the music is despairing, then the threshold edicts of our heart are broken. The love of life that brings joy has been sullied, and despair is our response. In approaching Levinas's ethics, we have emphasized the mystery or strangeness of the other and the role of proximity to the other, not a state of repose, but a restlessness that does not congeal into a structure, as crucial in opening up our own selves and so escaping the totalization that Levinas abhors. Toward understanding the relevance of strangeness or mystery in literature, we turn for the moment to another great Jewish scholar, Harold Bloom. Bloom died in 2019. I'm proud to say I had a corresponding relationship with this absolutely brilliant man. He welcomed my wife Rose and I into his home at one point. Couldn't have been more gracious. He treated us with such kindness, and he made connections for me that I still have. In his book, The Western Canon, Bloom recognizes strangeness as a criterion for canonical status. He writes, this is quoting, "I've tried to confront greatness directly, to ask what makes the author and the works canonical. The answer, more often than not, has turned out to be strangeness, a mode of originality that either cannot be assimilated or that so assimilates us that we cease to see it as strange. Dante is the largest example of the first possibility, and Shakespeare the overwhelming example of the second." That's from Bloom. Bloom's Western canon is restricted to literature. Drawing parallels in music, I would say that the strangeness of Mozart can be compared to that of Shakespeare. We've become so assimilated to the uncanny genius of Mozart that we no longer recognize how strange are the wonders of his art. Finding a parallel to Bloom's Dante, I think of aspects of late Beethoven, those last string quartets, if you know this music, the last piano sonatas, even aspects of the last symphony, and much of the music of Arnold Schoenberg, to be sure. The greater point is that, as in literature and as in the other arts, it is freshness of vision, be it auditory, ocular, or otherwise, that is the constant in great art. If this freshness is to be maintained, then the art we perceive or perform or compose must be susceptible to the hardening Levinas calls structuration. Its grammar is verbal, not nominative. I read that incorrectly. We must not be susceptible to the hardening that Levinas calls structuration. Its grammar is verbal, not nominative. Following Levinas as applied to music, we can say that our responsibility as performers, listeners, or composers is to be open to the other, and that this sense of openness augments our own selves. Along similar lines, we recall Hilary Putnam's point that not all relationships are the same. In music, while aspiring against the hardening of saying into said, we must simultaneously recognize that lesser artists have less to say. The greatest artists open imaginative space indefinitely. In English literature, we might think of Shakespeare as an example of the latter. His poems and plays are subject to unending interpretation. This is both from scholars and actors. We can live a lifetime with them and still find new meaning within them. For Jewish scholars of the Torah, the aspect is the same. We have millennia of commentary and no one has the final word. As a student of Torah, we recognize its open-endedness. The coefficient of thoughtful reading is responsibility to the text. Our responsibility toward humans extends toward that which humans make. Music is not only a human making. As I understand it, there is music in all of nature's makings. We humans perceive it and adapt it to our own expressive, cognitive, and emotional needs, and in imitation of God, creator of the universe, we co-create, learning for existence from the songs of the birds, but adding our own 2 bits to it. Adapting Levinas's ethics, our responsibility toward others in terms of hearing music, performing music, and composing music is kindred to the open proximity that Levinas has defined as fundamental to any ongoing human relationship. As I enter into my rhetorical coda space, I can say once again that it is not a state, a repose, but a restlessness. Outside of the place of rest, proximity does not congeal into a structure. I say once again that if we imagine ego boundaries as closed doors that seal us off one from another, then sustained proximity in Levinas's sense keeps the doors open, allowing us to stand at the threshold, gazing into the space that otherwise would have been sealed off. In music, the vision of my gaze is not ocular, my attentive focus is auditory, an openness to new modes of hearing that augment my sense of self, and in best cases remain open-ended, the transitive verbs of musical experience. I find it wonderful that the Hebrew word shema can be variously translated as hear, understand, give heed, and obey. Musical hearing entails a process of coming to know and coming to feel, both cognitive and emotional. When the composer is of the stature of a Mozart or a Beethoven, then the process of knowing and feeling can be sustained over a lifetime. Earlier on in today's talk, I mentioned that responsibility toward the other need not be restricted to first-person singular, first-person plural. We implies group responsibility, and that we are grounded in a larger family of persons, a more encompassing tradition. My final thoughts for today involve the productive tension between each individual as an individual and each individual as a member of a larger group, a more encompassing tradition. In the arts, it is the highly individuated voice or vision that we value most. And yet, if that voice or vision does not rub up against a larger tradition, it is without grounding, without meaning. Beethoven, as a symphonist and chamber composer, inheriting a musical language from Haydn and Mozart and others, and transforming it into Beethoven. Mahler is a symphonist and composer of song, inheriting a long and varied tradition, including suppressed Yiddishkeit, and transforming it into that unique voice we recognize as Mahler's. The strangeness of a canonical work is in its eternal workings and also within its modes of rubbing up against the tradition that gives it birth. And we remember that Levinas teaches us that openness to the other is what frees each of us from stagnating into a hide-bound totalization. And let us say, Amen. Thank you. Questions or comments?
Thought maybe you would talk about how
Is that fun?
But you would talk about how it would manifest itself, Levinas, into a Beethoven or a Mahler or something like
How?
that. How the Levinas,
Yeah.
Levinas
Yeah.
would translate into the musical composition.
So it's the openness to the other that I was thinking that I'm thinking about that he emphasizes. So you're not just sort of well, that sounds cool enough or whatever, fun. You're opening yourself to the imagination, the creative space of another human being. I was just talking with Rose this morning about Mozart again. I always go back to Mozart because he was the one that really made me fall in love with classical music. And a whole lifetime later, he still is a wonderment to me. And if you listen to his music and try to get inside his head, try to think, how could somebody imagine that? And he imagined these pieces whole cloth. If you look at his sketches, very little revision. The opposite of Beethoven, by the way. That doesn't put Beethoven down. It's like a divine influx in Mozart. It's incredible. How could that be? It's an unending puzzleness. So that's the mystery that Levinas uh, emphasizes so much. But there's also that Buber side, that intimacy, because, when you're hearing music or playing music, anybody who's played music, it becomes part of you, and you're embracing it like you would a person almost. Uh, so that side, that's important too. And like I said in my talk, I don't think you can merge the two. They have to remain opposed, but I think they're both very, very important. But yeah, it's the mystery. It's the mystery of the other. And to me, great art, whether it's literature or music, painting, whatever, it's refreshing in the sense that wow, never saw that before. That never saw that coming. Especially when when you're young and you're seeing your first Cézannes or whatever it happens to be. It's just like mind blowing that time and space can be imagined the ways these people do, and the ones that stay with you over a lifetime. Howard Bloom gave the example of Dante. Uh, I've read a lot of Dante over the years, and the strangeness never goes away. It's always strange. And his point is that for some artists, you can forget how strange they are. His example is Shakespeare. But if you really read Shakespeare carefully, it's how could a human being have made thought of these things? It's mind blowing. And it's the same with the text. I think of all of these things in the same bundle. And if our text is Torah, that open-ended, everybody knows this, that studies these things. There's no final word on it. So am I getting close to what you were getting at, or am I rambling on in every direction all at once? Yeah. He talks about music very little in what I've read, and I've read a good amount. Um, and I'm trying to remember the one example that stood out in my mind. It was an example by a composer radically reimagined string techniques for this violin, viola. And I can't think of the composer right now. Maybe it was Helmut Lachmann. It's a composer most people wouldn't know, contemporary composer who radically rethought technique. And Levinas speaks very appreciatively of that kind of opening into a kind of new world. But when I was first reading Levinas, I don't know, 20 years ago, something like that, it was the mystery of the other that really uh, that touched me. Because if you work with art long enough, that's what you start to recognize, over and over again, these extraordinary characters that are canonical, there's pop art that's very ephemeral, and not to put down pop art, it has its place in the world, and that's terrific and everything. But there's a reason why a lot of that stuff, it's great when you're 12 years old, and then it's nostalgic when you're 30, and you can sort of remember it when you're 50 and when you're 80. Go, what was that? Yeah. But the stuff that hangs around that transcends its period, that reaches a deeper core. And I think it reaches that deeper core because it hits a deeper core of us. That's we're ever changing, but there's also aspects of our humanity that are there. So
More questions? Sure.
yeah.
When you were just kind of formulating my thought for a second, the primacy of acknowledging the other in relationships and in communication reminds me of about 15 years ago when Leonard Cohen was doing his like around the world tour, many times. I had the privilege to see him, I think five different times. And he opened every concert by thanking the audience for being here and sort of stating what a privilege it was. And when I think about like a kind of a contemporary Jewish philosopher, artist, I just thought it was like a courtesy at the time. But to your point about, music that I listened to in the early 70s, that I listened to with as much, and I'll go and find the lyrics to try to make sense out of it. It may be that, and I don't know what was in his head, but this, deep respect for and appreciation of us who were listening to it, being part of the artistic experience. It reminded me of him. And then when you say, just to go on with Jewish musicians, when you say, people who like Mozart had sprung, out of his head like Zeus, reminds me of like, unlike Leonard Cohen, who would write a song for 7 years before he released it, Bob Dylan would scribble a song, and it would be done in 20 minutes, and then he would just move on.
Yeah.
And play maybe facing the audience or maybe facing the back of the stage.
Yeah, I hope it didn't come off as putting down pop culture because that's, I played as a young man. I played soul music, Otis Redding, James Brown, all those guys in a group in Brooklyn, and it brought me great pleasure. And I think I even back then thought of music as spiritual, even though James Brown, it's a different kind of spirituality. Bob Dylan is a wonderful example of this extraordinary person who's kind of in between. He's pop, but he's like, wow, such a creative, amazing mind and openness to the other, to his creative imagination. Always change, right? One of the things about Dylan was such a long career, and it was that malleability that always been a part of his voice, and the things that he's done. I actually published or co-published a paper on Dylan, Bob Dylan, at one point. So, yeah, sometimes the boundaries are blurred. Let me say something that I don't know, may be appropriate, may not be, but I'll say it anyway. One of the trends that I'm seeing in teaching music in academia, probably most of you are blessed to not have that experience. One of the trends that I've been seeing for the last 10, 20 years at least is the neglect to a higher degree than before. This is in university settings. The neglect of what I call the Western canon and the emphasis on pop music and kind of sociology of music and this kind of thing. I have a former colleague, he's a friend, and I respect him. He's a very, very bright man who just recently wrote a paper on a water fountain in Las Vegas and the music that's piped in while the fountain is going up. And that's an emblem of where music scholarship has gone. My feeling is this. It's not that pop music is worthless or not timely and not meaningful to people in its time and place. It's that youngsters, college-age youngsters, don't need to be told how to listen to Taylor Swift. They don't need a coach. They can do that on their own. But they do need access to late Beethoven. And they do need access to people I assume you've never even heard of that are our living composers. Cherlin, Helmut Lachmann, on and on. There's a fantastic world out there that in the United States, at least, very few of us even know about. For me to hear the music that of my own time, that I care about the most, I have to go to Europe. Why should that be? We have great musicians here. We have the infrastructure. Why should that be? It's that we don't value that culture enough, and we don't value, part of this kind of the hidden message, not so hidden, in Levinas, I'll get back to him, is that the openness to the other is, in a sense, a struggle, right? There's not a transparency there. It takes some effort. Art that really blows your mind, that opens your mind up to new ways of hearing, new ways of thinking. That takes effort. It doesn't come easily. It takes hard work to get at it, whether it's poetry or novels or music. It doesn't matter. It generally takes effort. There are people who are, can plug in like this, and hats off to those. But for most of us, myself certainly included, it takes effort. I remember, I'm going to shut up in 2 seconds, but I want to tell you this. I remember the first time I encountered Arnold Schoenberg's first string quartet. It's a big, massive piece of music. I came away from my listening with a headache. That's it. I had already heard later Schoenberg. I'd already heard contemporary music of all sorts. I wasn't a young kid. I couldn't. And it took me multiple goes at that piece before I had it in my head enough so that I knew where I was going, where I had been. I really knew that. And it became one of my favorite string quartets in the entire literature. But I had to overcome that. I don't have to remind you all. Israel, what does that word mean? Struggle with God. So struggle with God is a nice way of encapsulating the struggle that's, I think, inherent in anything that really opens up a space, that opens up your imagination to something that wasn't there before. It's going to seem odd at first or impenetrable, and take some patience. And all of us have our limits. I think I mentioned this in a previous talk. I think I've made it through maybe a half, if I'm lucky, of Finnegan's Wake. If I live long enough, I'll give it another shot. It's very, very hard, but it's mind-blowing, even to make it a third of the way through. All right, I'm going to stop. Were there any questions from online? Or
We have a couple more minutes. If there's any questions, any more questions here?
First of all, I really appreciate your talk today. And my question would be, was there any connection between, like, ever Levinas have interaction with other, like German, for example, when we talk about music in 20th century, we always talk about Adorno. So it's like, I was wondering, had he ever like communicate other than Husserl regarding arts or such any regards?
It's a lovely question. I don't remember reading anything about him interacting with. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. I don't. But his most famous student was Jacques Derrida, and Derrida brought the mystery of the other in an interpersonal language into the realm of how one reads, right? And so for Derrida, the meaning of a text is open-ended. It's that kind of thing. I personally think Derrida carries it too far. It depends on what text. But if I'm reading the recipe for chocolate chip cookies, I bet if I'm thinking open-ended, I'll never make the cookies, So it depends on the text. Derrida likes to come off like a wise guy. But that's one example. And there are others whose names are eluding me now that he interacted with. But I don't know about some of the German, like Adorno, whether he did. And I certainly don't remember reading anything in Levinas. I think he was grounded, well, I can't say that. I was going to say he was grounded more in French culture, but that's only a partial truth because he also read German philosophy, but the older stuff, the Husserl, yeah. So, yeah, but that would be an interesting connection to make something worth, for me at least, to look further into. I did talk about Adorno in was it the last talk? I think it was, because he wrote some important things about Mahler, very important. Thank you all.
Thank you.